I've written, as Michael says, a lot about the institution of private property, which as we understand it is very much an embodiment of individualism, and it also is very much embedded in it also are an awful lot of pro-industry, pro-development values that were picked up in the 19th century. Private property is an extremely important institution in our society. In fact, it is of all of our legal institutions that mediate between humans and the earth. It is by far the most important institution, I would say. Given its value, it is shocking how little time we spend thinking about it, where it comes from, what it should mean to own land. If we spent even a little bit of time, we would quickly realize that private property is very much a human creation, that it's taken lots of different forms at different times and places, that our ideas about ownership that we have today are fairly recent developments. They differ vastly from what people would have thought private ownership meant 200 years ago at the time the country was founded. It is a very malleable institution that can function in a lot of different ways, and we just need to figure out what's the best arrangement to meet our needs today. But in order to do that, we've got to stop and really study the institution, and right now it isn't being done. I suppose you could go further and say, well, really, at the root of all of this is just the way we understand ourselves as individuals, that we exaggerate our autonomy from the natural world. We think that we're morally worthy subjects, and the earth itself is just a morally empty object. I guess in philosophic terms, it would be what the subject of ontology or metaphysics. We would have a vastly different understanding of ourselves if we thought of ourselves mostly in terms of our relationships or interactions, not as an independent being, but in terms of the materials and flows and interactions, that we're more of a node rather than something with separate existence. Part of the fragmentation here, and goodness, I wish I could talk about this as well, because it's the subject of much of my writings, including one of the books that Michael mentioned, a book, the publisher thought it would be provocatively titled. I didn't really like the title one bit, but if you do book writing yourself, sometimes you don't even have control over the titles of your books. There was a book that Yale University Press put out a couple years ago called Why Conservation is Failing and How It Can Regain Ground. I think the environmental movement itself has got huge problems. I would offer as Exhibit A, maybe if Paul's slide were still up here about all the myths, things people say about environmental protection, environmental movement. All of those I think are factually wrong. All of them come from critics of the environmentalism. But the sad truth is that what people think they know about environmentalism almost entirely comes from critics, because the environmental movement itself has no voice. There is no speaker. I mean, I would encourage you to stop a minute and say, and do this. Name one environmental leader in our country who is not better known for something else.
Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson, I'm sad to say, is dead.
Exactly. That's my point.
And she would be a borderline case, because frankly, of course, she was better known for something else as a science writer. Right. People think Rachel Carson came out of nowhere. Good heavens, she was one of the biggest selling authors in the 1950s. In fact, it's a nice indication of how our culture has changed to look back and to see her book. The Sea Around Us, was that the one? It was on the national...
Silent Spring.
Well, no. Or earlier. I'm going back to, because she had several huge selling books. I think The Sea Around Us was like #1 on the nonfiction bestseller list for 18 months or something. I mean, can you imagine a book on marine biology being on the bestseller list, of being in the top 1,000? Or actually, an even better example, another example, in 1959, Peter Matthiessen came out with a book on Wildlife in America, which was a huge selling book. I don't know what the comparable one would be. If you know David Wilco's book from a few years back, I forget the name of it, but it was very similar, sort of a survey. I mean, I bet you it sales for at most 1% of what Matheson's were. Anyway, I don't mean to get off onto that, but there are, I mean, the environmental movement itself is just as fragmented as society generally. There are hundreds of groups, thousands of groups, each operating pretty much independently. There is no coherent message. They have not gotten behind any leaders. There is no equivalent of Martin Luther King, for instance, in the environmental movement. There is no one to speak on its behalf, and that, of course, opens it up for just all sorts of ridicule by critics, people who take out little anecdotal incidents or pick people on the fringe or something. I mean, the whole claim, I mean, it's often said, oh, those environmentalists, they only care about nature and not about people. You know, I would offer our environmental laws as a counterexample, which are almost entirely focused upon human welfare, upon the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food, and so on. In fact, I think the criticism probably would be that environmental policies, environmental advocacies are way too focused on human welfare and not at all focused, not nearly well enough focused upon the welfare of larger ecological systems. But anyway, enough of that. Well, if I'm right about this, I mean, if a huge part of our environmental challenge looking ahead is that we need to work together more, we need to come up with better, more sensible policies, more collective action, what would it take to do that? I mean, I wish the answer were simple. Obviously, to begin with, it's going to require new ways of thinking about ourselves and our relationships among one another. It's going to require, I would say, some clear vision of how we ought to be living on land. You know, Jeff in his comments was sort of heading in that direction because he was criticizing our farm fields, which are run just for corn and soybeans, and he added, well, shouldn't we be also taking into account biodiversity? Well, of course we should. I would go further and say, well, there's a whole lot of other considerations that also should be relevant here, and that maybe what we need to be doing is pulling them all together and coming up with some overall goal for conservation. You know, if conservation succeeded, what would success look like? If we were living well on the planet, what would that look like? I mean, granted that we humans, it's appropriate for us to use nature, that in order to live here we have to change it, but where is that line between using nature and abusing it? If we were living well, if we had sort of solved our environmental problems, what kinds of landscapes would we have? How would they operate functionally? What would be their sort of biological composition and so on? Well, one of the failings of the environmental movement today, I would say, is that it doesn't even think about that. It doesn't offer a vision. It tends to fragment our problems into lots of individual pieces and push them separately. Alas, efforts to deal with some of these problems individually can make other problems worse, and probably, you know, again, the discussion we've had today already is an illustration of that. We somehow think we have an energy problem. Well, I guess we do in a sense, but we tend to think of it as, oh, we need an increased supply of fuel for us to use, and so that's the problem, and so we're going to run out and we're going to grow lots of biofuel crops. Well, to grow biofuel crops, of course, is to start devoting a lot of your landscape to this, and there are going to be lots of environmental implications to that. If we understand our environmental predicament, though, not as simply an energy problem, but look at it vastly more comprehensively, and then we look at this proposal to devote landscapes to biofuel crops, it might be, when we do an all things considered assessment, that that's moving us in the wrong direction, that far from making our environmental predicament better, it is making it worse. But it's hard to know that unless we have something that we currently do not have, and that is sort of a list of all of the factors that we ought to be taking into account when making this kind of all things considered assessment I'm talking about. Or alternatively, we don't have some sort of overall goal for all conservation efforts.